welcome. If you saw my last video of my favorite AFK things to do on my Iron Man, you could probably tell what my favorite AFK activity is, and that is Wave 4 of the Zuck fight. Today, I want to examine if it's really worth doing it with a high input cost setup versus a low input cost setup, specifically using magic with strong prayers and overloads versus magic with weak prayers and no overloads versus necromancy with strong prayer and overloads versus necromancy with weak prayer and no overloads. Over the past week, I've spent about 20 hours doing nothing but Wave 4 Zuck with 5 hours at each strategy. So we're going to look at high input magic, low input magic, high input necromancy, and low input necromancy. What we're going to analyze is the strategies, the cost, the loot, and talk about my personal preference at the end of it all. So let's dive in. We're going to open up here by talking about some general strategies that are used in all 4 instances of AFKing Wave 4 Zuck. First and foremost, no matter what strategy we are using, we want to make sure after finishing the first 3 waves, we end up standing in this specific tile. You can tell this tile by going into the cove by the stalagmite on the western wall and moving 4 paces to the north and 5 paces to the east. We should also touch on things that are used in all 4 strategies. For each strategy, there's a few items that we'll use all the time. First, we'll be using a combination of Cinderbane gloves and weapon poison +++. However, if you don't want to use these for the low input methods, you don't have to. I would still use the Cinderbane gloves, however. We also want to make use of the proper variant of a Zuck cape. I personally use the hybrid cape for each setup. On each setup, we'll also want the passive prayer restoration of an ancient elven ritual shard. And for both high input setups, we want an additional prayer restoration object. Personally, I was using a blessed flask. Due to the nature of the scripture of full being basically self-sustaining while doing Wave 4 Zuck, we will be using that as our pocket slot item. As a bare minimum for perks, we would like to have Devoted 4 and Enhanced Devoted 4 at the very least. I like having a form of Scavenging 4 as well as a Biting perk involved as well. However, on my mage armor, I don't have Biting. If you want to go even farther with it, you can add Impatient 4 combined with your Devoted 4. You can also add a Holy Wrench in your inventory to increase prayer restoration. Because we talked in great detail about the inventory and gear that we're using for the high input magic strategy last week, video card in the top right, we're going to go kind of quickly when talking about it here. We want to be using tank magic armor, so we're going to be using a Sea Singer hood, an Elite Sea Singer top, and an Elite Sea Singer robe bottom. Of course, the top and bottom are augmented. For our weapon, we're going to be using an Inquisitor staff. Again, ideally perked with Caraming, but ours is perked with Precise 4, Aftershock 4, Ruthless 1, and Equilibrium 2. We will be casting Bloodburst and still have runes for Animate Dead as well. The main difference is we've actually changed the prayer that we were using as to what we said last week. Instead of using curses and just using Deflect from melee, instead we are now using the regular prayer book and using Protect from melee and Augury. In our necklace slot, we're going to be using an Arcane Blood necklace, and for our ring, we're going to be using a Reaver's ring. I personally use my enhanced Blast Diffusion boots for my boots. On screen now, you'll also see the Revolution ++ bar that I use. We're going to make sure we open with Sunshine and focus a lot with AoE and lots of stuns. So let's go check out the loot we got from 5 hours of high input magic AFK Wave 4 Zuck. Alright, so we finished the 5 hours of high input magic AFK Wave 4 Zuck. If we look at the chest, you'll see we have a total value of just over 47 mil, which maths out to about 9.4 mil per an hour. We're going to throw on screen the exact values of everything we got, so let's go look at that. So I decided to plug in the amount of defense XP that I started with and the amount of defense XP I ended with into this table. I chose defense XP because currently my magic is only training defense as I have 200 mil magic. I also plugged in the total value of the chest. What this tells us is we gained in that 5 hours around 1.75 million defense XP, giving us around an average of 350k magic XP per an hour, or defense in my case. The GP per an hour was roughly 9.4 mil. I also kept track of every item that I had gained in that chest over the course of the 5 hours. Next to it, you'll see the approximate number of items I got per an hour for each of these items as well. And finally, we have the most important table for our analysis, the costs table. As you can see, I paid attention to how many doses of everything we used. Now, I will say the extreme prayer is a little bit high because of the fact that when I did the 5 hours of the high input magic, I actually forgot about my elven ritual shard, so I was drinking a lot more extreme prayer. The thing to really keep track of is the elder salves. We used a total of 50 doses in those 5 hours, which means we use about 10 doses per an hour, or 1.67 elder overload salves. Now, according to the wiki, it takes roughly, with the boost that I have, 71 total herbs in order to make an elder overload salve. Now, we need to remember this number because this is what's going to determine if it's worth it or not for us in regards to using a high input method versus a low input method. Now, let's jump into the analysis of the low input magic method. When looking at the gear for the Wave 4 Suck setup for a low input magic method, the only real difference is actually in our prayers. Instead of using augury, we are actually using mystic might. The large difference between the high input method and the low input method actually comes from our consumables. Because we're no longer using augury and instead using mystic might, we no longer need our extreme prayer potions from our blessed flask. We're going to get rid of the blessed flask entirely. The other difference comes from our overloads. We are no longer using elder overload salves and instead just using super prayer renewal potions instead. The other major difference is in our action bar. With our new action bar, we have devotion and sacrifice at higher priority slots for increased survivability. Let's go check out the loot. So we finished our 5 hours of the low input magic method. If we look at the challenger's chest, whoops, I actually screwed this up and apparently only did 48 tros, which, let me just plug this into my calculator, is actually 4.8 hours. So for the next few numbers, these are actually going to be based off 4.8 in order to figure out the total XP per an hour and the GP per an hour. But if we look down here, you will see that we made 38,917,559 GP, which is just north of 8 mil per an hour. The only other thing that I want to mention is you'll see that my sealed clue scrolls for elites are actually at 30, and that is because I kept them in the chest from the last run in order to make sure I can continue to get elite clues without having to solve them. So let's go look at some results. Using the same kind of table that we used before, you can see that we gained 1.35 million XP in the 4.8 hours. This led to an average XP per an hour of about 282,000, with an average GP per an hour of 8.1 mil. Just like before, on screen now, you'll see all the items I got in that 4.8 hours and the average amount per an hour of each of the items. As I said in the last video, the input costs are a major factor in deciding on what is the best method for us to proceed with. While all the values are basically the same, what we have to keep in mind is that instead of using Elder Overload Salves, we are now using Super Prayer Renewals. With Super Prayer Renewals, instead of using the 71 herbs for 2 potions, we are now using less than 4 herbs per potion as an Iron Man. Keep this in mind as we continue down looking at the other methods as well. Let's move on to High Input Necromancy. We're going to see some clear differences between the equipment of our magic setup and our necromancy setup, obviously because they're different combat styles. The helmet and the battle boots are going to switch to tier 90 power armor instead. The top and the legs are going to swap to the tier 90 tank variant. We're going to switch our necklace into an amulet of souls due to the fact that onyxes are basically free, so they're self-sustaining here. On top of that, the weapon's going to be the tier 90 offhand and manhand for necromancy as well. We're going to swap the augury prayer into this necromancy equivalent, which is sanctity. I want to caveat this by saying you could probably use tier 80 power top and legs, but I did not have the supplies required in order to make these with the proper perks. On screen now is the bar that we're going to be using. It's going to open up with the Ghost, into Spectral Scythe, into Skeletal Warrior, into Soul Strike, into Soul Sap. We want to make sure we're getting the Soul Strikes out as much as possible because of the fact that that is our only stun. The Vengeful Ghost will keep our HP topped up nice and high. This is why I say it's probably possible to do with tier 80 power armor instead to reduce our drain rate, but again, I didn't have the stuff to do it. So the tank armor works just fine. Let's go check the loot. Alrighty, so we are done with 5 hours of high input necromancy. Let's go check the chest, and we end up with, oh my goodness, 51.2 mil. That is massive. Looking at it, it's probably not really, it's like we killed too many more things, but we definitely have a large stack of Hydrix bolts and onyx dust here, which is probably what contributes to a whole lot of this. Let me go plug some stuff in my calculator, and this gives us roughly 10.2 mil per an hour. Looking at everything, it is because we ended up with less items overall from all our other stuff compared to the high magic or high input magic setup, but we ended up with a lot more Hydrix bolt tips and a lot more onyx dust, so we may have just gotten lucky on those specific rolls. But let's go into the details. Looking at our table for the high input necromancy for 5 hours, we ended up with total XP gain of 1.75 mil, giving us an average of 350,000 XP per an hour. Our GP per an hour was roughly 10.2 mil. Again, this is because we got a whole lot of extra Hydrix bolt tips, a lot of onyx dust, and actually an extra onyx on top of it. Speaking of those items, on screen now you'll see the entire table of every item that we got during that 5 hours. As I said, some of these items are actually kind of low outside of those 3 big ticket items, which did boost our GP per an hour significantly. And as you can see for the cost table, it's basically the same as the high input magic setup with the exception of Extreme Prayer. And the only reason Extreme Prayer is lower is because this time I actually did remember my Ancient Ritual Shard. So let's compare it to the low intensity necromancy method. Similarly to the high input and low input magic methods, the high input and low input necromancy methods will use the same exact gear. The only difference is the Sanctity Prayer. Sanctity will be replaced with Hand of Doom, which is the accuracy prayer. Just like with the low input magic method, we no longer need a Blessed Flask due to the reduced prayer drain rate. We're also going to be swapping our Elder Overload salves into Super Prayer Renewal Potions instead. Surprisingly, our action bar actually doesn't really change. This is because the Vengeful Ghost is just straight up broken and heals you a ton. However, I did find that sometimes I would be running low on HP. So you could use a modified version of the old bar and just put Blood Siphon in at the very tail end of it. This should keep your HP topped up nice and high, and you should never run below probably 3/4 HP with this method. Now, I did make a little bit of a mistake while finishing this up because it was ridiculously early in the morning. I forgot to get a clip of myself collecting from the chest. However, the total chest value was around 36 million GP. The reason it was so low is because I got a bit unlucky and only got 1 uncut onyx. This gives us an average GP per an hour of 7.2 million GP. Again, it's low because of the lack of uncut onyxes. However, the XP wasn't too bad, around 1.4 million XP during the time frame, giving us an average of just shy of 285 XP per an hour. As always, on screen now, you'll see a breakdown of item by item of how much of each item I ended up inside of that chest. You'll see the items are fairly average throughout, except for that lack of onyx. Big sad. And now we have the cost for the low input method. Again, it is the same as it's always been in terms of potion dose cost. However, like I said, for the low magic input method, if we save a whole lot of money just because of the fact that we're not using Elder Overload salves and instead using Super Prayer Renewal Potions. Let's go through an overall analysis. What we can glean from this is from the difference between a low input method versus a high input method. When executing a low input method, we will gain about 80% of the total loot and the total XP. For XP values, that translates to roughly a loss of 70k XP per an hour. As for GP, that'll range somewhere between 1 to 2 mil per an hour lost using a low input method. If you're a main account, the decision is clear. You always want to use the most boost that you can, as the cost of the Elder Overloads is roughly 500,000 GP, but you gain an extra mil or two, and you get a lot more XP while training in this way. However, for Iron Men, it's a bit more nuanced, and this is because we have to use our own supplies. If you recall what I said in the beginning of the video, with the boost that I have, it takes approximately 71 herbs to make 2 Elder Overload salves, versus making 2 Super Prayer Renewal Potions costing a total of 4 herbs instead. Meaning, for reducing our costs by approximately 90%, we lose about 20% of our total net gain. Since this is something to do AFK, I would make the argument that it might actually be worth doing it in a low input method. In fact, the way that I'm probably going to continue doing this is with Super Prayer Renewals and actually scrapping the Weapon Poison +++s. And this is probably going to be my route to getting 120 Necromancy. So let me know in the comments below, which would you rather do, a low input method or a high input method? If you're interested in checking out my other favorite AFK methods, be sure to click this card. Thanks for watching, be sure to like and subscribe, and as always, have a wonderful day, and we'll see you soon.